Of the most tragic questions that I've ever been asked, can you help me make friends, has been the question that has haunted me ever since it was asked of me. I sat beside a man once as he asked me this, his eyes full of tears, both searching and pleading. And the worst feeling in the world, or one of the absolute worst, was that I knew that I couldn't. For he was difficult to love, more than most. And furthermore, easy to forget. Truth be told, most of the time, folks were thankful when he left, or when he didn't show up at all. My response to him that day was, I hope. And ever since I've uttered those words, I've come to understand the disdain that Jesus must have felt for those who remained lukewarm in the presence of who society would deem unworthy, or who thousands of years later Christians would consider unfit to attend the banquet, even going so far as to strongly advise the stewards of that banquet that those such as he were not the right kind of people to attend our dinner. And so it is with the invitation to a banquet today and the memory of fear guised as advice that I find myself hearing that question all over again and thinking of the many encounters I had with this man in the banquet hall long after everyone had left for the week. To those meetings, he would often arrive unannounced and in such a state that folks would often find themselves repulsed by the way he kept himself. On other days, he would show up clean-shaven, his salt and pepper hair parted to one side, and most of the time wearing a shirt, a pressed waistcoat, and creased trousers. He'd make his way to the chapel, often asking the office assistant if anyone was in there. And I think that was his way of making sure that he wouldn't make anyone feel uncomfortable, because after talking with him on many occasions, he knew that he had made many do so. This was his pattern. He'd often go to the chapel and then stop to see me before he left, telling me what he had heard in his prayers. One day, I decided to meet him in the chapel and have our discussion there in hopes of joining him at the source. Only now have I seen that what transpired between us was in a way always before the source, if you consider that source the banquet table of God. The day of the question, however, I had to fight the urge to head him off. Instead, I watched him walk past my door, knowing that in a minute it was my task to reason with him, and therein lay the challenge. And that was that no matter how emphatically I made my point, the nature of his illness would not allow him to comply with my request. And so I sat there, brooding over the impossible task before me and the unfortunate circumstance of being the bearer of bad news in a place that was all about preaching the opposite of it. This illness of his directly affected the nature of his condition and often left him fixated on a particular object or person. so much so that his gaze upon that said object or person was rather intense. But it was not harmful. This, of course, left those folks feeling extremely uncomfortable, even if they knew him. This happened frequently in his case with a particular woman. She was beautiful, often sitting in the back alone, deep in thought. And I think it was the combination of her beauty and the distance she kept from others that ultimately drew his interest at first. And for a time, he became unable to take his gaze from her. One day, the banquet hall was filled, washed in white. It was just after the feast of the resurrection. And despite the opulence of the feast and the promise that was made to all that day, his gaze breached some invisible boundary. And it's a boundary that we all have. And in response to that breach, the woman left during the announcements. Her abrupt exit prompted him to sit down right where he was. And in my memory, he has always kind of just melted back into the service. For months, neither of them showed up at Eucharist. That is, until late one fall. And the only reason why I remember that day was because of an understanding I received after that service from another gentleman. And that became the impetus for my need to speak with him a few weeks later in the chapel, the day of the question. The warning that was given to me by that individual was while the candle wax was still warm from the service. And it came by way of a pat upon his breast. Like a kiss, it betrayed the truth that what lay underneath his jacket was frontier justice, rather than the justice of God, or who through a grace-filled mercy saw all three of them as his own. And I thought to myself in that moment, what should I tell this man? That his life was in danger, even here in the banquet hall? Surely not. But I couldn't, in good conscience, take the chance. The truth is, many of us have been invited to such a feast without knowing it. And many of us have refused such invitations as tending to the needs of both those that are warranted and desired often seem more important, or at least in this man's case, a safer bet. But the feast shall go on, and not only will it go on, but those who are on the guest list beside the landowner will be those that have none. Next to those who are clean and fit will be those who are ill and forgotten. And next to those who can see will be those who are blind. Next to those who have, there will be those who have not, and who have no hope of paying back what has been given. And in short, that's all of us. It is noteworthy that the man in the parable does not merely open the doors so folks can come to him. Rather, he sends for them to be brought in, not kept out. And that those who minister to the sick, the friendless, and the needy are not bound by the demands of social etiquette or orthodox interpretations of the rules of propriety, but are rather tasked with the greater challenge of compelling those who are most in need, that they are as desired at the table as those that are already seated. The last conversation I had with Bill was about his death. He had come to church to finish his funeral arrangements. Living off of meager support, he had managed to save enough money for his burial. As he signed the contract, he left a note beside the tally that whatever he had left over in his bank account, would go to the church. As he handed me that check, I asked him if he wanted to go outside into the garden and pick his place. He did. And walking with him, I was there when he settled on a nice spot by a tree just outside the chapel doors. I explained to him that whatever remained of his body would be placed there when it was time, and that what remained would nourish that tree, giving it life, allowing it to grow tall and give shade to all those who would come to be with their loved ones. He smiled as he took hold of one of the branches, and he said, "Hello, friend." And unless my heart and my soul deceived me that day, I could have swore that I heard the tree answer back, "Hello, friend."